How do you approach teaming when your target is a massive elephant of a megacity like New York City? In this episode, Dave and I are going to unpack some outcomes from a problem-solving retreat that he and our friend Kyle Pearson helped to facilitate for those of us here in the New York City metro area so that we can come away having used word and spirit to look at the book of Acts and the journeys of Paul to discover what does teaming look like when there's crosswinds and persecution and isolation and all these kinds of challenges so that we can effectively multiply disciples, leaders, and churches until there's no place left, even in a challenging place like New York City. Going to be helpful for you and your teams. That's coming up. All right, Dave. So, we got some time together this last weekend as you made your way up to the metro here in New York and really helped us to kind of process through how to tackle a highly urban environment like this.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the time with you guys, Mark. I think that there's a pretty incredible team that has been starting to develop, and then just watching some laborers who have been there as many as 4 years, in the mega city of the world, and just seeing the diversity and the work that's doing, and then watching as individuals and families are just overcoming the barriers and the brutal nature of what an urban context like New York creates, where you're just pounded by the city over and over and over and over and over again. And just the things that really stuck out to me this weekend was just the tenacity of the group, just to continue to try, and even wanting to learn to continue to try, knowing that oftentimes they feel paralyzed. It's just overwhelmed at the sheer size and the magnitude of the task that remains. But the fact that they're coming together and saying, what can we learn and what can we do, was just a blessing, because they all realize there's not any individual one that is going to be able to get it done like this. The one thing I would pick up from all of our discussion is that New York City definitely pushes towards one thing, and that's team, because of sheer necessity. There's no other option.
That's right.
And so in a lot of ways, that overwhelming, brutal nature of the metro is beneficial, because it pushes in that way. And then the concluding thoughts that you kind of shared with what does it look like to aim for churches and multiplication and no place left, but not being able to go straight at that because of all the challenges that the city brings at you I felt like a really great discussion.
Yeah, and part of what we did over the weekend, you led us in a teaming study, and what we did to kind of engage in that was to look at how were leaders identified and ultimately entrusted with the ongoing work. Especially we looked at what Paul and Barnabas in their first missionary journey, and then Paul and then they split and part ways. But then as Paul continued on, as he began to recruit leaders in the second journey and onward, and I think that was really helpful to see how Paul he was raising up leaders on the go and as he went, as a part of that, because he experienced so much pushback and challenge as he went. And then as we approached the end of the book of Acts, we were reading over the weekend, just seeing how much challenge he had as he was heading towards Jerusalem and through Rome and all the different the trials that he goes through. And he's doing that alongside of other leaders. And in the midst of all of that, all those crosswinds, that's powerful to just see how he was investing in leaders along the way as a part of the strategy, and just to not be alone in the process.
Yeah, and we really kind of honed in on 4 areas of how he worked with those leaders. There's always more that you can look at. It just seems like it's an onion. You just keep peeling back layers, and you get a fresh new perspective each time you do it. But just how he identified them, how he equipped them in terms of his witness and their learnings with him, and then how they turned around and invested in the kingdom themselves. And then from that perspective, then Paul would begin to entrust them, where he would send them out and say, whatever they say is what I say, with that much trust in the work that they were doing. Perfect examples of that was when we were looking at the way he sends Timothy with the letters that he wrote to Timothy, and the way he entrusted him to establish elders in Ephesus. And then the same thing with Titus, where he's sending them down to Crete to establish elders in the churches, at Crete, and sending them with the full authority to do the work, to take care of that core core task and establishing the leaders, because there was work left to be done. And I think as we did that, I think the piece that really came to the surface was two pieces. One, how important team was, that Paul constantly was trying to get the work completed. Yes. And in some cases, Acts 13 and 14, we have the nice tidy bow that Luke tells us in the story where they started the work and then they completed the work by the end of chapter 14. But we see other pictures, like, for instance, when he writes the letter to Titus, where works happened in Crete, but it's not been completed, and he's not there anymore to complete it. And so he's sending, some emissaries or people, coworkers, if we're going to use I think the good biblical term for it, he's sending those coworkers to go and finish what he knows still needs to be completed in that core task that we see and talk about all the time with the 5 parts of, entry, gospel, discipleship, church, and leadership.
And I think it was helpful that you brought that in for us to kind of look at that and study that around teaming. And then you're bringing in just the importance of thinking about that in an urban environment like this. And Paul he's sending them and saying, I'm sending myself. And in that, he's making this statement that all of the DNA that Paul has is been transferred to these leaders, and right. He's entrusting them to continue to steward that for whatever target or place that is. But I think that's so helpful in terms of just thinking about approaching a place like New York City or just a highly dense urban environment, that Paul, he's raising up leaders that have the DNA of multiplication, having labored alongside in the work with him, so that he can now essentially multiply himself in planting that DNA of multiplication through different footholds and different targets across the whole region, such that, like you highlighted, Dave, he could say in Romans 15, from Jerusalem all the way around to Illyricum, I've successfully, there's no place left for me to work. I've preached the gospel. And did he do that personally? No, but he invested in leaders co-workers who were carrying that forward with the DNA as though Paul was there.
Yeah, I mean, we went through and looked at Titus, who, in the way that I look at scripture and the epistles and put some timeline pieces together, was Paul all the way back in Tarsus prior to Barnabas even coming and getting him and bringing him down to Antioch. So Titus has been with him for years, but we looked at Titus, we looked at Barnabas, we looked at John Mark and the relationship that they had that split and then came back, Silas. Then we looked at Timothy, Priscilla and Aquila, and then we looked at Luke. Because of time constraints, those are the ones that we looked at. But when we're talking about these leaders and these development of these teams, they weren't just something that was just developed because, a group of people just decided that that's how they were going to organize. It was really just living life, doing the work of the ministry and experiencing the barriers, the hardships, the wins and the losses together. I mean, even as we went through the story of Luke, just to watch him, whenever they take off from Miletus in Acts 20 after meeting with the Ephesian elders by the coast. Mm-hmm. And then you have them get in a boat, and Luke is basically with him from that point all the way through the arrest in Jerusalem, the trials. He gets on the boat, goes through the shipwreck, goes through the 14 days without food in the middle of a nor'easter. And, you watch all these things happen. And now Luke's hanging out with him in a prison in Rome. And as Paul's writing letters, his prison epistles, he's sending greetings from Luke to other people. Yeah. And so, those type of relationships are, they're just beyond a group of people who say, hey, we kind of want to do mission together. We have the same idea. Luke's got these guys that are brothers, just full on sacrificial brothers in the ministry. And you watch as those guys work together and cooperate. And as Paul is, hey, for instance, when send for John Mark, Timothy, and when you come through Troas, grab him and then grab my coat and grab the parchments. I need those as you guys make your way to Rome. And just watching the team interact and serve one another. It's just an incredible study to really just encourage us about what it looks like to serve, teams together. There was a language that a gentleman by the name of Todd Engstrom uses out of Austin Stone about first decision and second decision communities that I think was really helpful for me in our conversation, but also just to help us understand, first decision communities being those people who, I'm going to follow Jesus, I'm in. Second decision communities are those who are going, I'm up for, aspiring for, and walking in the leadership of the mission and of the task. And they're taking that next step to go beyond just being someone who's in the church, but being someone who's going to help catalyze more churches, and just watching as Paul has those second decision coworkers just step up to the plate and become, just shoulder to shoulder partners willing to sacrifice everything with him. It's just an incredible study to me.
What I feel provoked by in going through this study is there's this fractal of Paul investing deeply in a few guys that have got the right DNA and really just trusting the same way that Jesus did, and trusting, his target was the world. His target was all people.
Yeah, that's overwhelming.
That's extremely overwhelming. But in the midst of that, he poured deeply into a few guys, 12 guys in a boat. At one point, he's going over to visit the Gerasenes. He's got 12 guys in a boat. A couple times got boats, and that was his strategy. He said in John 17 that he completed the work that the Father had given him to do, and that work was not feeding all people. It was not even the gospel getting to all people. It was not the cross. This is before the cross. Instead, it's these leaders that are right there in front of him that he's raised up that now have the DNA of Jesus. And then the same with Paul. He's given his whole life. It's costing him everything. And he's got some guys that have stuck with him through the thick and the thin, but that they're entrusting that God can use that investment into a few to accomplish the Great Commission.
And as we kind of kicked off this conversation, going back to the crosswinds of what it looks like to kind of land the plane, using the metaphor that you pulled out, we've totally stolen from Chuck because it's super helpful. But the idea of when you're landing a plane on a runway, if the headwinds are like straight at you, you can go straight to the runway. But if you've got crosswinds, you've got to turn that plane into the crosswinds in order to land, straight on a runway. And so you actually have a plane that, is flying. It looks sideways sometimes if the crosswinds are bad enough in order for them just at the last moment to land on that runway and move forward. And I think one of the major crosswinds that was blowing very, very strong that came out of the weekend was just how isolating the city is.
Yeah.
In the last podcast, you told that David Brudrick story once again, which I think we need to tell that story over and over and over about the guys becoming more isolated as they got closer to the urban context, that fewer and fewer people were saying hello. And then they found that they were saying hello less and less, right? The closer to the center that they got. And so just that brutal nature of isolation. And I think the larger a city is, the more brutal that loneliness, isolation, crosswind becomes.
Right.
It just gets stronger and stronger and stronger, which to me is ironic that you can be surrounded by millions of people and feel alone. And that's not just with people moving to other cities. I mean, that's just the way those contexts treat everybody, believer or unbeliever, right?
Yeah.
And so the reason I bring that up is I'm just saying one of the ironies is sometimes we think the best way to complete or to tackle the isolation barrier is to shoot for, I need friends. And that we think going after friendship is going to solve the isolation barrier. But the irony is that if you shoot for just having relationships with people, you don't get those deep, those deep friendships that are based on loyalty and sacrifice and honor and all those things that make like Jonathan, David type relationships.
Yeah.
But when you go after mission together, when you go after target together, you're kind of changing the direction of that plane where you're saying, I want to defeat isolation. Well, obviously you need strong relationships to overcome isolation. But if you shoot for just relationships, you're not going to get the relationships you're looking for. You're going to have to shoot for walking in ministry. And I think that example that you're given with Jesus and all those leaders that are in the boat with him, he didn't gather those leaders by going and spending a lot of time with just those leaders. he gathered those leaders by spending a lot of time doing ministry with those leaders with him, so that they're experiencing together the wins, the losses, the hardships, the miracles, but then turning around after the miracles and watching the crowds turn on Jesus, and then doing that. I think whenever I go back, I love The Chosen. We've talked about it before. The disciples are in the camp, and they're arguing about, who's the greatest or whatever. Mm-hmm. And Jesus has been out doing miracles all day long. He's exhausted. And when he comes back into camp, they want Jesus to solve their problem. Uh-huh. And he's like, tomorrow, I'm exhausted. And then he goes into the tent, sits down, and picks up his feet, and they're bloody because he's, been on them and they're blistered. And he's just exhausted from doing the ministry. And the whole camp just kind of, and all the tension and all the fighting and all of the dissension that was going on among the disciples in that particular scene just dies, because they realize that's not the point. The point is the mission. The point is, and that's what really brings leadership teams together, I think came out of that study, is those relationships that are going to break us out of isolation, or those relationships where we're in the trenches together, not when we're just having a cup of coffee together, though having cups of coffee is going to be a part of those relationships, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, we just did this whole series earlier this year on the 5 T's, and I think that's been helpful for me to see. I think they're connected in different ways, but just coming out of the weekend to see target precedes teaming in some ways,
right?
Precedes rhythms around that. And so some of the conversation from the weekend just even being like, what are our rhythms together? But together really assumes there's a couple of the things in place before that. And so in combating the crosswinds, like you're saying, we got to have the target ahead of us. If you're going to land the plane, you got to keep your eyes on where is the runway, the target, and the team being your multiplying leaders is how you're steering into that crosswind, and then building some rhythms or consistency around that together helps you to begin to combat that in a practical day-to-day way.
Well, and we even had that principle that kind of came out that says, if you aim for target and you want a team, you can get one. If you aim for team, you don't get team ever. If the goal is just team, it doesn't work. Team has to have a reason for them to exist, a uniting factor, a common direction of movement as a reason for them to partner. And I think a lot of times people, even in my years of pastoring in churches where, I'm inside of a church that had conflict. I know that's surprising to everybody who's ever been in church. But watching them think that the way in which they overcome conflict is have more fellowships or spend more time talking or do more together. And the answer to it is purpose. The answer to it is the Great Commission. The answer to it is, let's have a common reason for us to be together. Because if you lose that common reason, then all of a sudden those things that cause conflict, personality differences, methodological differences, political differences, all those things start to take precedent. And in that scene, like we just talked about in The Chosen, it's the mission, the giving and the sacrifice for what we really believe in that just kind of levels all those things off and puts them in their proper perspective of importance. Because conflict really, Mark, you and I both know this, is really just a combination of the minors becoming too major.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Right. And the major thing, if it's worth sacrificing for, starts to bring the pieces together. And I would say the best friends that I've ever had in life have been the ones that are on the same journey with me in terms of no place left. Those have become relationships that make it through the hard conflicts. That make it through the bad decisions, that make it through, because we say, let's slow down. And if you want to continue on mission, then this relationship is worth my time, right? Because if everybody gets out of our boat, we realize we don't really have much that we can do.
And I think again, landing the plane, so to speak, on that analogy there, we're so blessed in America that we haven't experienced the kind of persecution Paul experienced, that churches and movements around the world are experiencing right now. But there's a lot of just intense crosswinds that we're not experiencing currently, but if begin to blow and come against us, evangelism, we share the gospel, that's going to get snuffed out if that doesn't lead to discipleship. And disciples all by themselves, that's just not going to sustain apart from
they don't sustain
church. And so we turn into the wind to try to make it to that target of seeing no place left, and we plant churches. But even then, those churches, if they're not, first of all, if they're not planted with a multiplying strategy or mindset, it's going to end with them, and it's not going to just keep pace with the continued growth of population. And then also, it's going to get snuffed out by just the challenges of the world. And so, if we're not aiming for multiplying leaders, and then it just solves so many things to aim towards 139 or towards the multiplying leaders, because it's going to come against the continued growth of population, against a city that's going to bring all of its crosswinds, and then a generation in which that persecution could increase. All of those pieces. But if we're pouring deeply into a specific few multiplying leaders, the world may come and try to take us out, but who do they take out? Because it's going to continue to multiply, right, even as it's oppressed. And so there's some keys there to the fact that we've got to focus on a few that have the right DNA in order to tackle a huge target.
Just reminds me of an illustration. I can't remember if it's in Team of Teams or in the guy who wrote the book about how General McChrystal, the man who actually organized and orchestrated all of it, because he wrote a book called One Team about the logistics of how they pulled off what McChrystal talks about in Team of Teams. I think it was in one of those two books. Pardon me if it's not in either one of them, but he tells the story of the Apache Indians and how they were basically undefeatable whenever they were in fights with them in the westward expansion. And the reason the Apaches were undefeatable is because there was no singular leader. There was the Apache way. And whenever one of the braves that was leading one of the small groups of Apaches was killed, then they all knew the most senior whoever came next, they would just get together and they would basically pick, and that person would then just lead the group, and they could just cut off one head, and 5 more would take its place.
Right.
And they were going at them and trying to attack them in that way. And what ended up happening is, for right or wrong is not part of my discussion here, but one of the leaders in the U.S. Army said, give them cows. And that's actually how they defeated them, was that they domesticated them by giving them property. And whenever they gave them property, then ownership started to take place. And when ownership started to take place, the community organization had to take place, because then they had to have leaders. But now, instead of being so mobile, where they were traveling, they were getting centered in one area and grouping up. And then whoever was the leader started to take leader for longer periods of time. And before long, that ability to just have multiple leaders being able to emerge started to decline. And then once they got centralized, they just took out the main leader. And from there, the tribe fell apart. Yeah. And they were using that as an illustration of whenever they were going after these ISIS fighters and all of the kind of terrorist basic organizations, there was a DNA that was in them.
Yeah.
And anybody was empowered to lead. And that was what was so hard, is that the United States was using a very top-down, leader-centered method that was just cumbersome and slow and couldn't respond. And they're going against an enemy that could respond just left and right, because anybody was empowered to make significant decisions.
Yeah.
And so that idea comes back to, it's very hard to take out a group that is allowing everyone to have leadership opportunities.
Yep.
Right. Yep. And you can push the analogy, too far. I think the point of the discussion for illustration purposes is, regardless of the morality of all of the illustrations that were discussed, the point is giving leadership to the edges and allowing people to have the full kingdom DNA, to know I can lead and my head is Jesus, is something that allows us to become extremely well, I'll use the word anti-fragile because it's the word that I'm using right now, but it allows us to be more than just durable. It allows us to grow because of stress, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Which in the sense of New York City, you might be able to play it off in some other areas and not see the necessity of it. But again, I'll go back to New York City. The one thing I took away from the weekend is there is no playing games there. That city will make you come face to face with the reality of the difficulty of the harvest immediately.
Thanks so much for just for coming out and for helping us to navigate through tackling a target and bringing in the place of teaming that leads to rhythms, so that we're doing this in a way that is a fractal that's scalable. So it was good.
Well, and we've talked a lot about the 5 Ts and the 5x5 and the crosswinds, and there's a lot of illustrations that are helpful on a whiteboard and in training. And just to toss it out there, June 24th through the 26th in Oklahoma City, we are going to be doing a strategy coordinator training using the 5 Ts. We'll post a link to that for you guys to know. But if it's something that you guys are listening to this, and one of the 12 people that might be listening to this podcast, just a joke, it might be 6. But if you're interested in going through that training with us, we don't have all the answers, but what we do know is there's a tremendous structure that we've kind of been filtering out. And we would love to have you here in Oklahoma City. Anybody who'd be interested, the 24th through the 26th of June, this coming June. So 2022.